You know, something I've realized is that throughout the entire history of this channel, I've never really taken the time to discuss any of Ninjago's villains. And boy, does Ninjago have a lot of villains. So I thought, hey, why not just make a whole video ranking all of them? So that's exactly what we'll be doing. For the first time on this channel, I'll be making a ranking video, giving my thoughts on every major villain in Ninjago, going from my least favorite all the way up to my favorite. All just based on my own personal opinions and takes, of course. Oh, and also, I'm only going to be talking about main villains for each season, so sorry, characters like Ultraviolet and Clancy don't count as much as I'd love to absolutely talk about them all day. So let's go ahead and get started, because we got a lot of ground to cover.
Sensei Wu, your spinjitzu looks rusty.
While Garmadon could be considered the main villain of the pilots, I feel like Samukai did enough to warrant him being on this list. That being said, he doesn't really offer much as an interesting villain, let alone character in general. I feel like his two lackeys are more memorable than he is, which isn't really a great sign. Samukai is here to push the conflict along, be a clone of General Grievous, and die. So, yeah, not necessarily a great villain in my opinion, and an easy pick for the bottom of the list. Omega genuinely has to be one of the most forgettable characters in all of Ninjago, which is honestly a huge shame considering he and his army of Oni were hyped up so much throughout the first two installments of the Oni trilogy. His design is really cool, and his theme is fitting and threatening, though not really super memorable to me personally compared to a lot of other villain themes. But the main thing for me is that his on-screen presence is kinda pitiful. His strange voice combined with the fact that he doesn't really do anything but just stand around the entire time he's in a scene just does not convince me of his supposed power at all, and the few fights he does get feel rigid and awkward. The only thing that sets him above Samukai for me is a somewhat interesting dynamic with Garmadon, but the fact that I can barely understand what he's saying most of the time makes it harder to appreciate, let alone remember any of the actual dialogue. As far as motives go, he's a pretty blank slate, just wanting to eliminate the powers of creation so that destruction can reign supreme. And while it does make sense given what we learn about the Oni, it doesn't really make him any more interesting. I appreciate that he's able to act as a bit of a contrast to Garmadon and deconstruct the humanity within him, but besides that and his design, I'm afraid Omega just doesn't really have many redeeming qualities for me. Crux and Acronics are, in my opinion, how not to write comedic villains, and I call them comedic villains because besides their poor attempts at quips and humor, there really isn't much else to remember about these guys. Their backstory kind of feels forced into past events, though technically not necessarily contradictory. Their motive is pretty bland, and their dynamic is repetitive and just not that interesting. I like the concept of two twins, but different ages due to one being stuck in time, but they only really use this premise to make jokes about how one hates technology and the other is obsessed with it, and it gets old really fast. And that's most of their banter, just arguing about that exact same idea. I do feel as though Acronics gives a decent first impression in the premiere, but even then his dialogue is unbelievably cheesy and I really can't take him as a serious threat. And you know, I'll admit, there's a bit of ironic appreciation I have for their cheesiness. I don't hate all of it, but for the most part, I'm just not a huge fan of their brand of humor. I do find it neat that with the whole sibling theme the season has going for it, Crux and Acronics are able to act as a bit of a parallel to Kai and Mia as well as, to a certain extent, Wu and Garmadon, but nothing is really done with that idea, so it's just kind of a bit of missed potential there. They don't pose much of a threat, their plan is cool, I guess, but it kind of just limits the interesting time travel stuff to being at the very end of the season, and they kind of just come across as pathetic with how easily they're defeated. Overall, I just find them a smidge enjoyable because of their ironic appeal, but mostly just bland, annoying, and not really all that interesting.
Unagami!
I have said this already.
Yes, Unagami, the villain that shows up for a grand total of like 5 minutes of total screen time. I talked about him a good bit in my Prime Empire retrospective, and my opinions are still pretty much the same. Unagami has a lot of potential as he is literally the embodiment of Prime Empire. He is the game, but nothing is ever done with that concept. He shows up one time before the final confrontation, and that's his best scene in my opinion, because it shows his sheer power and rulership over the world of Prime Empire, but nothing like it ever happens again. He is such a non-existent threat because all he does is periodically send henchmen after the ninja, making no attempt to really stop them in any interesting ways despite the fact that he has full control over the world that they inhabit. I enjoy his backstory and his motives are clear and interesting, with his abandonment issues tying into Jay being adopted, but that connection is only made by the very end so that they can quickly redeem him and wrap up the conflict. The ideas for Unagami to be an amazing villain are all there, but the execution leaves me wishing they made him a bigger focus. As is, he just feels super super underwhelming, and I find it hard to connect with his story in any meaningful ways.
No! You broke my spell!
Still resting comfortably in forgettable villain territory, we have Sensei Yang. You know, I don't have much to say about this guy, but I do think he deserves some credit for how he's actually able to help build up Cole's character a bit and show off more of his undying compassion for others. Like, the fact that they gave Cole a sympathetic villain to deal with here that he's able to inspire and help out is just kind of heartwarming and really in character for him, especially knowing what we know after Master of the Mountain. It's interesting to see how Yang and Cole both relate to the same struggles of dealing with mortality and not wanting to be forgotten. If the special had more time, I think it could have been really interesting to explore that dichotomy more. The climax remains as one of the only things I can fondly remember about Day of the Departed, even if it doesn't really cross my mind that often. Yang doesn't do much as he is kind of pathetic as a villain, but as a character, I think he serves his purpose well enough and actually helps define Cole more as a character. It's a very small step and more definitely could have been done here, but I do appreciate it for what it is. And the fact that Yang chooses to sacrifice his chance at becoming human again is a welcome decision, since I'm not sure this guy should have gotten off the hook completely, so they're able to kind of redeem him while making sure he still has to live with his choices. I'm kind of shocked, but yeah, I genuinely don't really mind this guy. His lack of screen time holds him back a lot along with the special he was a part of, but his motive connected to Cole's fear of being forgotten as well as him highlighting Cole's compassion for others is something that I think can be appreciated, despite the pretty wacky execution. Guess I did have more to say about this guy than I thought. Honestly, pleasant surprise, but far from one of the best villains Ninjago has to offer.
2.5. 3.
So the Overlord is a really weird case because I see a lot of the potential in this character, and that's surprisingly due to Crystallized of all things. If it weren't for that season, I actually think I would have ranked him considerably lower, but that's not to say he's great in Crystallized either. The Overlord conceptually is both really cool and really lame to me. Like, it's kind of hard for me to describe how I really feel about him. There's cool lore and history that makes him feel important and threatening, but there's also the fact that he's just super bland in one note. Though Crystallized rendition of the character intrigues me because of how they implement the idea of him wanting to shift the balance in hopes of ending all conflict throughout Ninjago, as the balance is built on the conflict between light and dark. I think that's a really cool angle, but it being crystallized and all, that's quickly forgotten about as he just goes back to being as one note as ever by the end. But even then, his fight with Wu is incredible and he consistently poses a pretty decent threat, but nothing he does amounts to much, and there really isn't any substance behind the character or many of the actions he takes. Yes, his fight with Wu looks great, but in terms of story, it doesn't really do anything to push it along or make me feel like the stakes are any higher than they were before. It doesn't really establish anything new about him, and you could say that about so many of the scenes he's in. There's so little to actually be taken from so much of his screen time.
I don't believe it.
His okay screen presence and overall importance allows me to place him above a handful of other villains, but I can't really place him any higher because of how boring he is and how the writers just refuse to give him any amount of depth despite the potential they clearly show him to have. Does the Overlord need to be super complex to be good? Of course not. There's a lot of charm in simple villains, but he doesn't really have the screen presence or personality to carry him. He simply is just too basic to be incredibly effective, in my opinion. And I think he's one of those villains that could actually benefit from having a lot more depth to him. So while it's unfortunate, I feel that the big bad of Ninjago is pretty underwhelming.
Even now, they scheme against you, plotting and planning.
Vex is one of those villains that I often forget exists, but when I go back and watch his scenes, I'm always kind of pleasantly surprised. Maybe it's just because I find it hard to find many redeeming qualities in the Ice chapter, so I appreciate when there's a character that I don't have much complaints with, but yeah, Vex is a pretty effective and hateable in a good way type villain. He's far from being one of Ninjago's more interesting villains in my opinion, but the way his story with the Formlings ties into his need to feel powerful is really satisfying to watch play out. I just wish the season was consistent with its stance on powers, as this story, which I think has a good message about how relying on power can be a bad thing, directly conflicts with Kai and Nia's over-reliance on their powers, which really muddies the messaging. I also really don't care for the fact that Vex removes a lot of the potential that Ice Emperor Zane had by turning it into a basic Amnesia story, where he pretty much just becomes the main villain, with Zane just being his super evil weapon that does all his bidding. Vex is a solid antagonist, and I think he is the first on this list to have an actually fully well thought out backstory and motive, but the way all the characters around him are written kind of brings him down, and I'm really not a fan of how he hijacks what could have been a really interesting Zane story, though with better character writing for Zane and some reworking of the plot, I think the two could coexist. In a better season, I think Vex would have been a standout, but since he gets lost in the mess that is the Ice chapter, he just kind of falls into obscurity for me.
You treacherous dog! You deceiver!
Asphyra is a fun character. Sue me. She is one of the few Ninjago villains that I feel like is never really supposed to be taken all too seriously, which is why it's jarring how Wu consistently reacts to her presence like she's the worst thing to ever happen to Ninjago. The confusion behind what she's capable of and where she even comes from is an issue for me for sure. Like, we know she's a sorceress, but that's never really explained what that means. Like, how does she learn magic? Is it just the staff? Where did the staff even come from? And the retcon of Serpentine history, while technically still fitting into the lore, feels pretty out of left field to me. Like, if she's supposedly a Hypnobrai, then why does she look so different from the other Hypnobrai seen in the Serpentine War and modern Ninjago? I don't know, maybe Ninjago lore historians can tell me in the comments. But overall, who cares about all that? Because Asphyra is just a goofy snake lady that says revenge, right? And while I know there's a lot of people that will argue she was more than that in the Fire chapter and kind of got reduced to that in Crystallized, I don't know, I feel like she's pretty consistently goofy and not meant to be taken that seriously. The Fire chapter's more lighthearted tone is definitely not for everyone. I mean, really, I'm not even sure that I like it all that much, but if it does anything, it benefits Asphyra by letting me just enjoy her over-the-top antics. And for what it is, her backstory episode with Wu is one of my favorites from all of Season 11. I enjoy how Wu's past with her is what enforced his beliefs at the time in never trusting snakes, which he would go on to pass down to Lloyd after Pythor tricked him in a very similar fashion. I don't know, I just think the parallels are cool. Do the parallels kind of end up making her feel like a watered down version of Pythor? I mean, yeah, kind of. She's a snake who's finally awoken after a long time of imprisonment, only to feel wronged about events from the past and wanting nothing but revenge. But I think she has a unique enough charisma to her and on-screen presence that make her stand out. Though unlike Pythor, who could act as both a serious and comedic threat, Asphyra is kind of just purely comedic and doesn't hold nearly the same weight. Yes, she can be funny, yes, her backstory episode is enjoyable, but other than that, I don't really see much else going for her. I enjoy when she's on screen, but she's not a villain that I crave to see more of. She served her purpose, made for some interesting Wu lore, and didn't overstay her welcome. And hey, she's pretty good in Crystallized too, I guess? Though, like the rest of the council, she was completely underutilized and her appearance failed to really add anything of note to her character. Oh, Crystallized.
The mechanic is back, Ninjago!
The mechanic is actually a decently charming villain these days, and I honestly think he has the 11-minute era to thank for that. He started out as kind of a joke villain in Skybound, but I think it's interesting to see how he has evolved over the course of the show, going from an ordinary street crook to making his name known and even teaming up with the Overlord. It's a fun progression to see unfold that I can't really say is done with any other villain in the show, so I think it's worth giving him some credit for. And his personality is fun enough as well. Just kind of reminds me of an old-fashioned mustache-twirling villain, which for some people may be boring, but to me, with the mix of that and his crazy electronic gadgets, it makes for a decently entertaining foe. He's got quips, he's got robo-arms, and he's got an actually pretty interesting progression with each appearance. Only really staggering now with Dragon's Rising, which, you know, is fair, because where else do you go after teaming up with the literal embodiment of evil? Well, you become a Doc Ock clone, I guess. Sure, why not? I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say he was already heading in that direction by Crystallized. And speaking of Crystallized, yeah, despite the fact that it gives him a huge level up and some really cool action, not every one of his scenes is, you know, the greatest. Though, thankfully, Dragon's Rising mech shorts were kind of able to get him back on track, so that's nice. But yeah, it's the mechanic. I don't really know what else to say. He's cool, I guess.
It's okay. She's with us.
Oh, Harumi. The character I used to love to hate, then became kind of just okay with, began to actually hate, and now just feel kind of lukewarm on. Harumi has gone through a roller coaster of quality in my eyes. Never have I seen a character in a show that in one episode can drastically shift my view on an entire series in an incredibly compelling and mind-blowing way, and in another episode be promoting some of the worst messaging I have ever seen in any piece of media ever. Harumi at this point to me is barely even a character, just a jumbled mess of ideas and stories all rolled up into one indecisive wildcard that serves whatever purpose the plot demands of her. And I'd honestly be lying if I were to imply that Crystallized is 100% at fault for that. More like 95% at fault, so let me explain. Oni Trilogy Harumi on her own, I think would still be a top 5 villain for me. The way she challenged so much about what we knew about Ninjago's stakes can't be overlooked. While definitely not flawless in my opinion, her backstory and motive to get back at the ninja for not being strong enough to save her family is to this day one of the strongest we have seen in the entire show. I went super in depth about the episode Game of Masks in a separate video that you can also go ahead and check out if you'd like to. But the reason I made that video to begin with is because I truly think it was a revolutionary episode for Ninjago. Harumi is a character that was able to weave her way into our main team of ninja and sabotage them from the inside. She was clever, strategic, playing a role and putting on an act, only to break Lloyd's heart and shatter our perspective on any of the show's previous conflicts. She was ruthless, straight up murdering her own adoptive parents and risking her own life just for the one goal of reviving who she believes to be a true hero and watching as Lloyd loses everything that ever mattered to him, just like she had to. Just a twisted game of physical and psychological revenge that dove way deeper than any other villain revenge story had done in the past. But under that fascinating premise is an execution that I would argue is kind of mixed. Far more good than bad, but still far from perfect, or at least far removed from what I initially gleaned from the character. You see, I consider Harumi putting on the mask of hatred to be the first turning point for the character, the moment we begin to see the first minuscule steps towards who Harumi would later become. Take a second to reflect on how I described Harumi before. Smart, strategic, playing mind games at every turn. With everything we had seen of her up until this moment, I was convinced Harumi was who she claimed to be, always 2 steps ahead, thinking things through, able to outsmart our heroes at every turn. That's what made her intimidating, but what happens next shows a clear and sudden departure from any of that. But before I get into that, what I think manages to hold it together is her desperation, and her clearly unstable mind, which is hinted at and shown more as her facade begins to break, and I love watching as she becomes more careless and desperate as she gets closer to achieving her goals. But I can't help but feel that her attempting to kill Lloyd off in an enclosed environment while completely forgetting about the fact that she needs him for the ceremony to even work is already a tad character breaking and makes me second guess her intelligence. Not to mention that the fact that she doesn't even try to capture him after he escapes from the Oni temple, which in that case is kind of just a straight up plot hole, isn't really a great or consistently intimidating impression of the character. Well, before she was clever and always had the upper hand, within the same episode she clearly displays a lack of basic common sense that very easily could have messed up or at least greatly delayed her whole scheme. I don't need her to be making perfect decisions all the time. It was already established she could make some stupidly risky plays at times, and she wasn't perfect at keeping up her facade, but the drop of intelligence from pre-mask Harumi to post-mask Harumi is very jarring to me. But I think another thing that slowly begins to crumble as time goes on is the nuance behind the character. What is initially a deep and compelling story about betrayal slowly turns into Harumi going against her own beliefs and kind of just becoming a standard evil supervillain bent on power and control. I'm fine with her losing sight of her original goals if it felt more natural, but here it just kind of feels like a 180. Almost less like it was an intentional change that she went through, and more like the writers just need an excuse for the city to be in danger. Because yeah, at the end of the day, you have to have stakes. A big part of Harumi's hatred towards the ninja was because of their inability to protect people and the damage that was caused, but now she is going after innocent towns with big evil rock monsters and threatening them with no remorse, causing massive damage throughout Ninjago City just to get back at the ninja. Her sudden obsession with power feels sudden and disconnected from her previous motives. Like, yeah, she always wanted power over the ninja as a way to get back at them, and more specifically Lloyd, to torment them with their mistakes, but her aggression towards standard civilians is what I'd consider the second strike against her character alongside her drop in intelligence. Before Sons of Garmadon can even come to a close, I feel like Harumi faces 2 contradictory elements that feel like they go against who the character was set up to be, already making her feel slightly out of character and directionless by the season's conclusion. Is any of it character ruining? No, but it makes me less invested in her story than I would be otherwise, as the inconsistencies make it harder for me to connect to the character and show a loss of focus within the writing. To many, that's just part of the character's charm, her erratic nature, but to me it kinda just feels like a symptom of the story maybe not being as well thought out as it could have been. Moving on from that though, while I feel like her character dips even more in Hunted despite having some standout scenes, I think her ending manages to fix a lot of my issues I have with the character. While not making me fully forgive the problems, her coming to the conclusion that she had become too far gone and helping a family in need instead of choosing to continue to tear one apart out of her own frustration and trauma shows a clear sense of healing. Even if I could argue it is a bit out of left field, the progression is solid enough to make me buy into it and really appreciate how her story started and concluded. Within the isolated seasons of Sons of Garmadon and Hunted, she's easily a top 5 villain with clear flaws that bother me but work themselves out a bit by the end. A bumpy but fascinating road to say the least. But then, of course, Crystallized had to be crystallized and basically ruined everything. I think I've already gone on enough about how I feel about Harumi, and at this point I feel like it's pointless explaining why I disagree heavily with her writing in Crystallized. I have a whole hour-long review of that season, with timestamps if you're interested in hearing why exactly I hate the season's take on the character so much. But yeah, it's pretty safe to say it made her go from an easy top 5 to not even making my top 10. Exemplifying the messy aspects of the character I already disliked while adding entirely new problems, plot holes, and out-of-character traits, while having the audacity to claim her as being fully redeemable by the end. And worst of all, completely ruining the character death that I just got done praising earlier. It really did not do her any favors. But hey, I can still look back on and mostly appreciate Oni Trilogy Harumi for what she did for the show. Anyway, that was a whole tangent. Let's just get to the next character.
I'm going to tear through the ninja with rifts in reality itself.
So, I think it's pretty appropriate to have Beatrix in the dead center of the list, as middle of the road is exactly how I would describe her. I like Beatrix, she's a good villain, but I think her as a solo entity is a tad boring, even if she has a really great role to play in the story. The biggest issue with Beatrix to me is that Imperium as a faction is a far more interesting threat than any one character within it, which unfortunately negatively affects Beatrix. But that's not to discredit what she does to make Imperium so interesting. It's fascinating to see how she tries to take control of Imperium. The show gives us plenty of examples of both funny and genuinely disturbing ways in which Beatrix uses lies and uses false claims to convince her subjects of her power and leadership. The lengths in which she goes to preserve their allegiance only for her to begin to go mad as soon as that begins crumbling, to me is a far better example than Harumi of how you escalate a villain and in turn raise the stakes of the story. Her desperation and frustration is clear, but her beginning to fully lose control of her people is what causes her to fully lose control of herself. Without Imperium or people that give her the attention she desires, she's just a maniac mad for power, and that's exactly what Roz was able to manipulate within her. Is she the most interesting villain in the world? No, but she serves the exact purpose the story needs of her, and has a lot of truly unique qualities that set her apart in her own right, even if I credit a lot of that stuff to the way Imperium was handled as a whole. She's pretty much the definition of middle of the road for me, but not bad by any means, and in some ways actually kind of influential for the show, as Imperium is the first villain faction of its kind to really emphasize its many moving pieces and show how layered the manipulation is towards the citizens they control. It's just all around really impressive storytelling.
I am the Green Ninja! You made me believe!
Moro is a pretty good villain that peaks in the season premiere and kinda just dwindles out over time for me, leaving off on a conclusion that I still don't really know how to feel about even all these years later. During the first and I'd say second episode, Moro is an absolute standout. His introduction scene alone is such a strong one, perfectly setting up the stakes, personality, and power of the character. His first scene being him easily overpowering who we assume to be the most powerful of our main cast of ninja is a strong first impression. And after that, he makes easy work of the rest of the ninja in a scene that doubles as a great introduction to his power set, has a tense and climactic 1v1 with Wu, and then escapes with the staff. Dude summons a ghost dragon. Like, it's hard to name a villain that has a stronger opening few scenes, which is why it's so disappointing to me to see where he goes next. That's not to say he completely falls off though. His backstory is one of my favorite villain origins in Ninjago, even if it's very derivative of another animated villain that's done much better in my opinion. But really, Moro being fueled by his obsession with becoming the Green Ninja after feeling lied to by Wu is really captivating and adds a bit of a tragic layer to his story without feeling too overly angsty like it easily could have. Trust me, the angst is there, but his reaction to being told he isn't the Green Ninja, while not being justified, feels earned considering the context. And this was also back when Wu having an old enemy come back from his past wasn't nearly as overdone, and in this case the student-mentor relationship is a really interesting one to explore for a villain origin. It's really interesting to see that even Wu had to go through experience like this and learn to become a better mentor, and that he wasn't automatically great at it immediately, and that he made mistakes. It shows why he was so worried about telling the ninja about the prophecy in the first place back in season 1. Moro's existence is one of those wonderful instances of added-on lore that actually enhances previous stories, unlike a villain like the Hands of Time that feel kind of forced into the past events of the show. Moro feels like a natural addition that impacted how Wu would approach training his students in the future, and go a long way in humanizing him even more. And of course it acts as a good motivator for Moro, as we see his frustration of feeling lied to is at the forefront of his actions. His jealousy of Lloyd clouds him, and his desire to feel seen and amount to something compels him most of all. But while the first 2 episodes set him up to be a compelling and threatening foe, the rest of the season doesn't really do him a ton of favors for me. He takes strong action towards his goals throughout the season, which I appreciate, but he never feels like he's nearly as scary, powerful, or even as witty as he was in the premiere. A lot of his dialogue just feels bland and uninspired. His banter with his henchman ghosts isn't all that entertaining or funny, and the bratty side of his character starts to become more apparent than his scary or threatening side. It becomes harder to take him seriously over time, as his appearances start becoming more tedious than they are fun to watch. And while he picks up again in the finale, I have a hard time buying his sort of redemption. Like, the idea that in the last few seconds of the Preeminent being defeated, he matured enough to recognize his faults and give himself up just feels kind of forced to me. It's a solid conclusion to his character, and I understand that him finally getting the recognition from Wu is what pushes him to make that choice, but it's not given the proper setup it needs to actually work for me. Overall, Moro sets himself up to being one of the show's best antagonists, but over time kind of just goes out with more of a whimper than a bang. I still appreciate what they do with him near the start of the season, and I can accept his conclusion even if I don't love the execution, but to me, he's mostly missed potential. There's still enough there to make me appreciate him, but he's not a villain I necessarily love.
I am your king! I am your king!
Vangelis suffers a similar problem to the Overlord, where he's a bit too generic for his own good, but in a season where Cole is the main focus, the fact that he plays off of Cole's character so well is what makes him work for me. Him being the opposite of Cole in a lot of ways really elevates him for me, not to mention the twist. Even if predictable to many, it's still a pretty satisfying reveal. Vangelis is one of those cases of being exactly what he needed to be. Nothing more, nothing less. He isn't incredibly compelling on his own, but he challenges Cole in meaningful ways and represents everything he vowed to fight against. He is the definition of conniving and uncaring, evil in all the best ways. You want to see Cole beat him up, and it's so satisfying once he finally does. Vangelis isn't a bystander either. He takes action and hunts the ninja down. His presence is a consistent threat, and he remains threatening throughout, only really being depicted as pathetic or weak after he is defeated. Vangelis is cool and fills the exact role he needed to. He may not be that deep or layered, but he works for what the story needed, and for that, I very much appreciate him. I also feel like he's a really good contender for best villain design in the entire show, if I'm being honest.
I prefer the term gene.
Who cares?
Nauticon and Skybound as a whole have both become pretty controversial over the years, and trust me, I see the issues. Skybound is full of them, and Nauticon is far from an exception. But I don't know, man, I just think he's really cool. Yeah, he's full of plot holes, dumb moments, downright gross moments, and has a motive that starts strong but devolves into one of the worst villain motives in the show, if not the worst. But what he does have is screen presence, and I love a villain with good screen presence. The voice acting, the dialogue, the animation, and the framing of every shot. There are some genuinely phenomenally written scenes in here, especially between him and Jay. And I love it when we have a villain that's really able to get into the main character's head. But yeah, I recognize the issues this guy has. His wish powers are nonsense for a multitude of reasons. The fact that Jay's last wish even works shouldn't be possible. Why does he even have people be wished away when he can just strike them with the blade? Since when could he just alter parts of Zane's mind? That doesn't make any sense. But for some reason, I don't care that much. I mean, to an extent, yes, I do care, and it stops Nauticon from being too high, of course. And yeah, there really is no excusing the Nia and Delara plotline. Not only is it dumb from a storytelling perspective, like, why sidetrack so much of your already good villain motivation of rebuilding your old home for this random infinite wish nonsense that only ends up backing the writers into an impossible corner to get out of in the end, forcing them to practically undo the entire season. But it's also just really embarrassing to see how Nia is handled throughout this whole story, and these flaws with that plotline rub off on Nia in a really unfortunate way. Like, yes, Nauticon is supposed to be a villain, but there was some stuff they included here that just was not necessary. But as for his original motivation, I really like it, and his plan is super cool as well. Lifting chunks of Ninjago into the air to create his own home is such a fun concept, and the initial scene where we see him witnessing the destruction of Ninjago firsthand is phenomenal. And who can forget his crew? The Skybound crew is easily my favorite of the funny enemy faction sidekick character trope that the show seems to love so much. And watching as some of them slowly switch on Nauticon is really interesting to see unfold. I love the scenes of Flintlock questioning Nauticon when he finds out he's hiding information from them, and the whole mutiny scene is just really enjoyable and a great way to showcase Nauticon's dissonance from his crew as he descends into madness. And oh my goodness, the line delivery here is just so good.
Enough! It will never be enough!
The scenes of him trying to get Jay to break are phenomenal. His introduction with Klaus is great. There's a lot of stuff to enjoy, but there's also just as much stuff to scratch your head at and wonder what the writers were thinking when they wrote some of this stuff. Just like Skybound itself, I suppose. So as much as I'd like to rank him higher, I can't, because at the end of the day, his story is super messy. His powers make barely any sense. His IQ fluctuates constantly, and I don't even think I need to continue to explain why the Delara plotline is bad. Sorry, Nauticon, but your cool screen presence and voice performance can only take you so far.
We still don't know where Lloyd and Garmadon are.
Bad! Find them, Klaus!
Chen is just delightful. A great example of a villain you just love to hate. Besides his obviously enjoyable theatrics and screen presence, I think my favorite thing about Chen is how he's able to manipulate those around him and steer the tournament in his favor, making quick work of any tricks the ninja may try and pull to reveal his true intentions. The season doesn't try to hide that he's the villain at any point, but watching as the team slowly unravels the true scale of his evil plans and finding out how they tie into Wu and especially Garmadon's past is fascinating and paced out really well. He may be a pretty generic case of wanting powers so he can take over the world and all that, and that does kind of make him a bit less interesting by the end, but everything he does during the tournament and everything we learn about him during that span of episodes is really well done. He appeals to the desires of those around him, trying to trick and deceive at every turn so he can get away without others catching on, even going as far as to tempt Kai with information about his parents. I also think his obsession with power being tied to him feeling lesser than others because of not having an element of his own also acts as a good way to help me buy into his motive more. He's stuck in the past, unable to move on from a grudge, and yearns to be seen as a formidable foe. So watching as he manipulates a whole group of elemental masters to achieve just that is just really interesting to see unfold. And I thought I might as well throw in Klaus here as an honorable mention, since while he does kind of fall into the category of side villains, his dynamic with Chen is such a big focus that I thought I should at least mention him, because on his own I would probably rank him just as highly. I love how he always wants to use his powers to stop the ninja at any point, while Chen truly sees the power in keeping up their reputation. Klaus is willing to cheat in order to achieve their desired outcome, while Chen would rather play the long game until the very end. Chen isn't fair by any means, but he wants a good show and thrives in the fun of it all. Their dynamic is really fun to see play out and makes both of them incredibly hateable in their own ways, in a good way of course. Overall, just a really fun and charming hateable duo of villains that were perfect for this season. Iron Baron is a villain I never really see talked about much, but it's often brought up how underrated he is, and I would have to agree. Iron Baron may be one of the most evil Ninjago villains out there, fueled by nothing but pure unbridled selfishness. He is similar to Chen in his thirst for power contributing to his manipulation of those around him, but what Iron Baron does stoops even lower, as a whole civilization of dragon hunters lives under his boot. He's willing to do anything to get what he wants. He doesn't value anyone or anything, treating lives like they're expendable and not even respecting his own henchmen.
Rules. No boundaries he doesn't flinch at torture.
He thinks that by lying and by stepping on the toes of others, he can get exactly what he wants and earn the respect of Firstborn just by seeming powerful. But just as he thinks he's won, the harsh reality hits him before it's too late, leading to one of the most satisfying villain defeats in Ninjago history. Seeing Iron Baron finally get what's been coming to him after Wu calls him out for all his flaws is so well done, and to this day, one of my favorite scenes in the show's history. This death really sticks with you, not only because it's surprisingly gruesome for this show, but because it represents the greater message of Wu's journey throughout the season, and how character can truly shape how others perceive you. Seeing how the Dragon Hunters overcome Iron Baron's reign over them, and discover they are worth more than just what he wanted to use them for, is inspiring, and a welcome twist on the typical villain henchman trope we had seen for so many seasons. Sure, Skybound tried to do a similar thing, but it works so much better here because not only is Iron Baron just a way more competently written antagonist, but because we see how these people blindly follow him until discovering his true nature firsthand, his cruelty, his lies. Faith is an amazing addition because she is an example of some of Iron Baron's worst behavior. She is forced to hide who she is from others and can't be herself, only to realize everything she thought she knew was a lie, to keep her in line and to stop her from venturing too far or asking questions. It's a heartbreaking revelation that only could have been possible with a villain as horribly evil as Iron Baron. Honestly, a phenomenal villain.
And now, our dark journey can begin.
Lord Roz has been such a fun new villain to watch. Call it recency bias, or maybe me just getting too ahead of myself, but I truly think Roz is already a standout. He is a tad underwhelming in Season 1 for sure, and I was honestly pretty disappointed with how he was handled there given how cool he seemed in the trailers. But Part 2 of the season did a really good job at establishing more about who Roz is and how he's able to manipulate Beatrix into taking over her own home just so he could fuel his own demand for Source Dragon energy, eventually culminating in him escaping and doing that same exact manipulation tactic with Jordana. Season 2 Part 1 is a massive upgrade for him as we not only learn a bit more about his past and connections to his master, but we also see him take more action throughout the story instead of just sitting in the background. It's clear that he has been planning things for a long time, and he makes it clear how dead set he is in achieving his goals. And something I really enjoy is how much mystery there is surrounding him. As of writing the script, we've yet to really learn who his master is or even what his entire plan or goal is in all of this. What we do see, however, is how his master helped him to become stronger by choosing to rely on power. His obsession with ancient power tying back to his history with the idea of strength and how he feels that it's the best way of becoming stronger. He tries to feed these ideas into others, offering them power like his master offered him, even going as far as to pick on the ninja's supposed weakest link by playing into his insecurities about him not being able to get any stronger. This is the kind of stuff I love to see from a good villain, the ways in which they tamper with the minds of our main characters and prey on their weaknesses. It's something Roz excels at, and I can't wait to see where his character goes in the future, because as of now, he is already one of my favorites.
You'll have to do better than that to unite the tribes. Get your hands off me!
Pythor to me is a great example of simple in premise but fantastic in execution. He is just all around such a charming antagonist with a wonderful voice performance, amazing design, and super entertaining on-screen presence. He's mischievous, funny, and genuinely threatening when he needs to be, but his character doesn't rely on it. He doesn't need to be the scary big bad, but more of a kind of conniving, vengeful ruler that expects everything to go his way. But that's not to say he doesn't get stuff done when he has to, it's just often from cheating or lying. He's able to, through trial and error, take command of the Serpentine through his wit and charisma alone. He assembles a team of blind followers out of once independent tribes, so spiteful towards the surface world that he is blind to see the consequences of his own actions, stuck in tunnel vision, seeing the Devourer as some kind of savior that will solve all of his ills with the world. And while he definitely peaks in Season 1, his other appearances are also incredibly fun in their own right. Crystallized, of course, failed to give him a reason to actually be there besides fan service, but his writing is still on point, so I have to give them props for that. Not only is he great as a main villain, but he also fits incredibly well as a supporting villain, and overall, I just find him a joy to watch every time he's on screen. Truly an iconic villain that has stood the test of time.
Dad, why do you have 4 arms?
Now, Garmadon is a complicated character to say the least. There have been a lot of iterations of him over the years, which is why it's so impressive to me that he honestly is a really great character no matter what season appearance you pick from. For this list, I'm only really considering his villain appearances, but even when he is on the good guy's side, he's still one of the most entertaining and interesting characters in the show's run. Some iterations of the character are surely better than others though, his role in season 2 probably being my least favorite. While the comedy with him here is enjoyable, it kind of overshadows his whole character to the point of me not really being able to take him as seriously as the show wants me to at points. Garmadon was always pretty comedic in season 1, but they balanced that out with his genuine struggles with being bitten by the Devourer and how that one moment had forced him to go against the people he cares about. I love how season 1 places emphasis on his relationship with Lloyd and how there's clearly humanity and empathy within Garmadon, but due to his nature and the evil in his blood, he can't be the father Lloyd needs. In concept, yeah, it is pretty silly sounding, but the heart is there and that's what I enjoy about it. Season 2 feels like it takes that inherent silliness that Garmadon had and cranks it up to 11, while also making him a lot dumber for the sake of both comedy and the plot. He doesn't really come off as a serious threat like he had before, and it devalues the scenes of him and Lloyd that I think could have had more impact otherwise. Not to mention how the Overlord pretty much takes his place as the main villain, which kind of misunderstands a big part of why the final battle was so exciting to begin with. There's still good stuff here, don't get me wrong, but season 2 Garmadon just feels like a misstep that brings his character down a little bit for me. But then you have Sons of Garmadon. Back when the season was revealed, the idea of Garmadon coming back to life as his evil self was controversial, but somehow they pulled it off in a way that makes me enjoy this version of villain Garmadon even more than his season 1 and 2 appearances. Seeing Lloyd have to battle against a version of his father that has zero humanity and empathy for him is so captivating. The scene where Lloyd faces his father in Cryptarium prison only for Garmadon to denounce him as his son and make quick work of him is devastating and one of my all-time favorite scenes in Ninjago. And from here, it's a fascinating story of Garmadon slowly rediscovering his humanity by first forming a connection with Harumi and later being confronted about what it means to actually be alive. Watching as Garmadon goes from a seemingly emotionless monster to discovering what makes him different from the other Oni and slowly learning what makes living life worthwhile is really cool to see unfold, especially with the context of who Garmadon used to be. It's impressive to see the writers get so much mileage from bringing an old fan favorite character back from the dead, and it's a good example of why reversing character death doesn't always have to be a bad thing, as long as you have a new and interesting story to tell with that character. I am sad to say though that Crystallized does kind of fail at wrapping up Garmadon's humanity arc in a satisfying way. March of the Oni left his story pretty open, but it was clear that he learned something from the experience, even continuing to grow in a really impressive comic series. But Crystallized kind of regresses him by implying that he didn't actually learn anything and that he needed to be taught these basic emotions by Vinny after the fact. It's a funny concept, but it wasn't needed, and I felt like it's a step back, especially after the comics did such a better job of building off of what March of the Oni did for the character, having him continue rediscovering his humanity more naturally through his own actions and choices. Regardless of that though, his post-revival story is one that I think elevates the character a lot for me, and overall, I think Garmadon is a fantastically written villain that was able to really challenge Lloyd in some interesting ways while going through a really interesting journey of his own. He's one of Ninjago's most iconic characters for a good reason.
Surface dwellers! In my temple!
Well, it took me a while to know for certain. After writing out my thoughts on each and every villain, I feel like I can safely say that in this current moment in time, Kalmar is my favorite. With Seabound being my favorite season of the show, it really only makes sense. I mean, Kalmar is just one of the many aspects I adore about that season, and while he isn't perfect, the things I enjoy about the character far outweigh the cons. From the second this guy appears on screen, I was absolutely shocked by just how expressive and alive he felt. Not only in his dialogue and performance being so full of personality, but by the way he is animated. It's just like nothing we'd ever seen in the show, and I feel like it kind of paved the way for characters like Roz being so expressive, with the way he's animated just bringing so much unique flair to the character. His opening scene does a fantastic job at establishing his sky-high ego and dominance over his henchmen while just oozing with flair in a clear direction that sets him apart from other villains in the show. Lines can be drawn between him and other antagonists for sure, but to me he feels like a blend of a bunch of different villains while also sticking out in his own way. He effortlessly balances being comedic and threatening like Pythor on top of the obvious story parallels while having the brattiness of a character like Moro and the selfishness of a character like Chen or Iron Baron. He even takes extreme measures to achieve what he wants like Harumi, with both of them willing to kill off those closest to them just to get what they desire. Unlike many of the villains I mentioned though, he has no sad backstory or supposed tragic past that informs his actions. No, he is just that evil and petty. And while some may see this as making him more two-dimensional and flat like I accuse characters such as the Overlord for being, the difference is that he has such an entertaining personality and screen presence and does some of the most insane stuff that makes it tremendously satisfying to see him fail. And that is just what makes for some of the best villains in my opinion. I love to see the crazy ways in which he furthers his plans just as much as I like to see those same plans be thwarted by our team of heroes. He does what so many of the show's past villains were able to do, but executes them almost flawlessly. And while that doesn't make him the most original villain we've ever seen, and while his motives are about as shallow as a puddle, he is so incredibly effective in what he does, I hardly care. And that's not even all, because while Kalmar takes some of the best aspects from past villains and combines them to create an incredibly fun and immensely hateable antagonist, he also makes way for one of Ninjago's best hero-villain dynamics, in my opinion, and it doesn't even have to do with any of the main ninja. I have a whole video on Benthamar's story in Seabound and his dynamic with Kalmar, and how he learns to grow past him and accept that he has others that care about him. And to me, it's just a standout story of the entire series. Kalmar's ruthless disdain for his brother and how he manipulates his naivety to his advantage really helps sell how beaten down Bento feels by the time he meets the ninja. Not to mention showcasing even more just how terrible and irredeemable Kalmar is, and watching Bento finally stand up to him in the end is so immensely satisfying as it combines what I mentioned earlier about how Kalmar's irredeemability makes it so good to see him fail, with the satisfaction of seeing the underdog succeed and overcome his struggles. Seeing Kalmar's face as his crown shatters into pieces is a moment that feels immensely earned and thoroughly built up to, and it's one that just wouldn't have had the same impact if Kalmar wasn't as good of a villain as he is. Favorite side character, favorite main villain, Seabound will always stay winning in my books. And that's it. That's every villain ranked. Let me know in the comments why I'm wrong and why I ranked your favorite villain terribly. And yeah, feel free to make your own list in the comments as well. Sorry this video took so long to get out. It's been hard finding inspiration and the time to work on these scripts because I've been working on so many other projects, just both in my real life and both for this channel, that aren't exactly standard video essay type stuff. Of course, I have my Ninjago crystallized rewrite coming up, and I just finished writing the very first draft of that whole thing. So depending on how many revisions are made, hopefully it will be coming out soon within the next couple of months. We'll just have to wait and see. And I also have a really exciting project for Monkey Kid fans. That's also going to be a pretty big, different endeavor for this channel, so I'm excited for that as well. But yeah, really happy to be jumping back into video essay content. Still absolutely stoked for Dragons Rising Season 2 Part 2 and Monkey Kid Season 5 once the English dubs, you know, actually release. But yeah, in the meantime, I just got a bunch of fan projects that I've been cooking up, so hopefully you guys are interested and excited. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.